Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Indiana. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the early hours of an autumn night in 1984, a freight train departed a small rail yard in central Indiana under conditions that dispatch logs later described as ordinary. Weather reports noted light fog, no storms, and mild temperatures. The route was familiar, the crew experienced, and the schedule routine. There was nothing in the paperwork to suggest that this run would become anything other than another entry in a long ledger of completed journeys. The train belonged to Conrail, the federally formed railroad corporation still in the process of stabilizing America's rail system after decades of private collapse. By the mid-1980s, Conrail operated vast stretches of track across the Midwest, including Indiana's industrial corridors and rural spurs. Its procedures were standardized, its communications tightly logged, its movements tracked with mechanical precision, which is why what followed proved so difficult to reconcile. According to dispatch records, the train checked in at its first signal point without issue. Speed was steady. Cargo manifests were complete. The engineer's voice, preserved in a brief radio exchange, sounded calm and unremarkable. Then, somewhere between two scheduled reporting points, less than 20 miles apart, the train vanished from contact. At first, dispatch assumed a technical fault. Dead zones were not uncommon in certain low-lying areas, especially where aging infrastructure intersected with wooded land. Protocol required waiting several minutes before escalating. Those minutes passed without response. A second call went unanswered. Then a third. What unsettled dispatchers later was not the silence itself, but its timing. The train should have emerged from the dead zone within 7 minutes. Instead, the line remained quiet. Signal indicators showed no passage. No alerts were triggered. It was as if the train had paused, yet no such pause was recorded. County rail logs show that maintenance crews were notified shortly after. Local authorities were not. At that stage, there was still an expectation that contact would resume, that the train would reappear farther down the line, its absence explained by equipment failure or human oversight. But the next signal point remained clear. By dawn, the train had missed every scheduled checkpoint. Yard supervisors began checking arrival records. Nothing. No engine. No cars. No crew reporting in late or rerouted. The line ahead was intact. The line behind showed the train's last confirmed passage. A clerk later summarized the situation in a handwritten note. Movement recorded. Arrival absent. As search efforts quietly began along the route, residents near the tracks reported hearing nothing unusual that night. No derailment, no explosion, no prolonged horn blasts. One farmer stated he heard the usual low rumble in the distance, then nothing at all. He assumed the train had passed. It had not. By midday, Conrail supervisors were forced to acknowledge what the paperwork suggested but could not explain. A fully loaded freight train, operating on active track, had failed to reach its next station and left no physical indication of where it went. No wreckage, no emergency call, no deviation logged. Just a stretch of Indiana rail where a train entered and never emerged. Once the initial disbelief passed, the response became methodical. Conrail's internal procedures treated unexplained silence as a systems issue first, not an emergency. Dispatch supervisors reviewed telemetry, radio logs, and signal data from the previous hour. Every indicator confirmed the same sequence. The train had entered the segment on schedule and then ceased to exist as a moving object. By late morning, track inspectors were sent out in pairs, traveling slowly along the line in both directions from the last confirmed signal. Their instructions were narrow: look for damage, obstruction, signs of derailment. What they found instead was continuity. Rails were aligned. Ballast was undisturbed. Switches were locked in their proper positions. One inspector later noted in his report that even vegetation along the Reithof showed no sign of recent impact. Grass leaned as it always had. Brush was unbroken. If a train had left the tracks at speed, the land had not registered it. Attention turned to the crew. The engineer, Frank Delaney, had 23 years of service and no disciplinary record. The conductor and brakeman were similarly experienced. Family members reported nothing unusual before the shift. No illness. No agitation. All three had signed in on time and were familiar with the route. County sheriff departments along the corridor were notified only after the physical search produced nothing. Even then, the request was framed cautiously. Assistance locating a delayed train, not a missing one. Deputies checked crossings and nearby roads for signs of emergency response. Fire crews, ambulances, road closures. There were none. A local dispatcher recalled later that what unsettled him most was the absence of secondary reports. Trains are loud. Even in rural Indiana, their passage is noticed. Yet no one had called to report a crash, a fire, or even an unusual stop. The silence extended beyond the rail system into the surrounding communities. By evening, Conrail issued a quiet internal bulletin acknowledging a loss of train location. The wording avoided implications. No public statement was released. Freight schedules were adjusted around the affected segment, but the line was not closed. In the days that followed, search efforts expanded. Maintenance crews checked sidings, spur lines, and storage yards where an unscheduled stop might have occurred. Nothing matched the missing consist. Car numbers did not appear in any inventory. Yard masters across the region confirmed no unlogged arrivals. Newspaper coverage remained minimal. A brief notice in a regional paper mentioned a delayed freight causing schedule disruptions. No mention was made of disappearance. Editors later explained that rail delays were common and rarely newsworthy. Within Conrail, however, the tone shifted. Engineers were interviewed again. Dispatchers were asked to reconstruct the radio timeline minute by minute. One supervisor wrote that the case resisted normal failure models. The phrase circulated quietly. What troubled investigators was not just that the train was missing, but that the system showed no sign of reacting to its absence. No alarms, no collision warnings, no track occupancy errors. The infrastructure behaved as though the train had completed its route, even though it had not. By the end of the week, the search had produced only confirmations of absence. The rails were clear. The yards were empty. The crew had not been seen. And the segment of Indiana track where the train had last reported in became something else. Not a location of impact, but a boundary beyond which records stopped making sense. As the first week closed without discovery, the language around the incident hardened. Internally, Conrail began referring to the event as an anomalous loss, a term borrowed from insurance classifications rather than accident reports. It implied neither blame nor cause, only absence. Engineers assigned to adjacent routes were quietly questioned. Several recalled passing through the same segment in the days before without incident. One engineer, however, noted something he had not mentioned earlier: a brief loss of radio clarity near the midpoint of the stretch, lasting only seconds. At the time, he attributed it to equipment age. After the disappearance, the detail took on new weight. County records show that a joint meeting was held between Conrail supervisors and state transportation officials. No transcript survives, but later testimony suggests disagreement. State officials pressed for a derailment explanation. Conrail maintained that no physical evidence supported it. The meeting ended without resolution. Search efforts shifted outward. Helicopter surveys were conducted over wooded areas adjacent to the track, focusing on ravines, waterways, and abandoned quarries. The surveys found nothing consistent with a wreck: no disturbed soil, no metallic debris, no scorched earth. The absence grew more pronounced the farther investigators looked. Families of the crew began pressing for answers. They were told little. One spouse later recalled being assured that trains do not vanish, and that the delay was procedural. The reassurance did not explain why days had passed without contact. A railroad historian consulted informally remarked that even in cases of theft or sabotage, rolling stock left trails, cut fences, altered switches, unauthorized signals. None were present here. The line's integrity was intact before and after the disappearance. Midway through the second week, Conrail issued a formal incident code to insurers, marking the train as unrecovered. This designation was rare. It acknowledged that the company no longer expected to locate the equipment in normal operations. The absence began to attract quiet speculation among rail workers. Some suggested misrouting, others clerical error. A few mentioned older stories: wartime trains lost to bombings, or early industrial accidents buried under progress. These comparisons were dismissed quickly. The system in 1984 was not prone to forgetting entire trains. A maintenance foreman inspecting the last confirmed signal point noted something subtle. The signal had logged passage, but the wear patterns on the rail beyond it were lighter than expected. The difference was marginal and could not be quantified. Still, he wrote, track does not show continued weight. The note was filed and never cited again. By the end of the second week, the line resumed normal traffic. Trains passed through the segment without issue. No delays. No equipment failures. The system behaved as though nothing unusual had occurred. Yet for those reviewing the case, the return to normality was itself unsettling. If something catastrophic had happened, there should have been residue. If something procedural had gone wrong, there should have been correction. Instead, there was continuity layered over absence. And in the files, the train remained listed not as destroyed, rerouted, or delayed, but as having entered a known stretch of Indiana rail and never completed the distance that followed. With the line reopened and traffic normalized, The investigation entered its most difficult phase, the period where absence had to be explained without disruption. Conrail's priorities shifted from recovery to accounting. Every document tied to the train was pulled and re-examined: cargo manifests, crew rosters, maintenance histories, fuel logs. Nothing suggested misidentification or clerical duplication. The train had been assembled, cleared, and dispatched as a single, traceable unit. The cargo itself complicated matters. According to shipping records, the consist carried mixed freight, industrial parts, sealed containers, and several empty cars scheduled for redistribution. Nothing hazardous, nothing valuable enough to invite theft on the scale required. Insurance adjusters later noted that even coordinated criminal diversion would have left financial or logistical echoes. None surfaced. Attention returned to the crew's last transmission. Audio technicians enhanced the recording repeatedly. The engineer's voice cut off mid-sentence, not abruptly, but as though the transmission had simply lost context. There was no sound of braking, no raised voice, no emergency code. One technician described it as a sentence that stopped needing an ending. The phrasing was removed from the official summary. Local authorities quietly canvassed communities near the route again, this time with different questions. Had anyone noticed unusual activity days later? Equipment being moved at night? Temporary road closures? Residents reported nothing beyond the ordinary rhythms of rural Indiana. Life had continued uninterrupted. A rail worker named Samuel Klein, stationed at a yard 2 counties away, later submitted a voluntary statement. On the night of the disappearance, he claimed to have heard an unscheduled radio transmission, static-heavy, distorted, lasting only seconds. He could not identify the voice or content. At the time, he ignored it. After hearing of the missing train, he reconsidered. Investigators could not corroborate the transmission. As weeks passed, Conrail faced pressure to close the matter. With no wreckage, no bodies, and no evidence of sabotage, the case resisted classification. Regulators accepted a provisional explanation citing unresolved operational anomaly. It satisfied no one, but it allowed paperwork to move forward. The crew's families were offered compensation under missing person provisions. Accepting it required acknowledging the possibility that recovery would never occur. Some accepted, others refused, holding to the belief that silence was not proof of loss. Within rail circles, the stretch of track acquired a quiet reputation. Engineers did not avoid it, but they paid attention when passing through. Radios were checked twice. Signals were watched carefully. Nothing unusual ever happened again. That consistency became part of the problem. In internal memos, one supervisor noted that systems failures tend to repeat unless corrected. This one had not repeated and had not revealed what needed correcting. The implication was unsettling. Either the failure had resolved itself, or it had never been mechanical to begin with. By the end of the year, the train's designation changed again. It was no longer listed as unrecovered equipment, but as missing, cause undetermined. The phrasing acknowledged a permanent gap in the record. And in Indiana, along a perfectly functional stretch of rail, trains continued to pass through a place where one had entered the system, obeyed every rule, and then, without sound or trace, stopped being part of it. By early 1985, the disappearance had slipped from public awareness into a narrower circle of record keepers, engineers, and families still waiting for definition. Officially, the case remained open. Practically, it had stalled. Without wreckage, witnesses, or deviation, there was nothing to pursue except repetition, and there was none. What emerged instead were inconsistencies too small to classify as evidence. A transportation analyst reviewing signal logs noticed that the missing train's final transmission coincided with a brief synchronization adjustment in the regional dispatch system. The adjustment lasted less than a second and occurred automatically, a routine recalibration meant to keep clocks aligned across terminals. The analyst noted the coincidence and moved on. No one could explain how such a correction would affect a physical train. Maintenance crews continued routine inspections. One foreman recorded that wheel polish marks, the faint shine left by passing steel, appeared slightly lighter beyond the final signal point for several weeks after the incident. The difference eventually vanished under normal traffic. The observation remained anecdotal, unsupported, and unfiled. Rail unions requested briefings, concerned about crew safety. Conrail assured them that no hazard had been identified and that no additional precautions were required. Engineers accepted the explanation publicly, but privately many altered habits, keeping transmissions shorter, acknowledging signals verbally even when not required. A retired dispatcher, interviewed later, reflected on the case with visible discomfort. He said the problem was not that the train vanished, but that the system behaved as if it never needed to react. In accidents, systems fail loudly. Here, everything remained quiet. The families of the crew pressed again for a broader search. Conrail declined, citing the exhaustive efforts already undertaken. One internal memo noted that reopening ground searches without new indicators risked institutional acknowledgement of impossibility. The phrase was never used again. As months passed, references to the incident became more abstract. Training materials mentioned it obliquely as an example of why redundancy mattered. Insurance documents treated it as statistical anomaly. The train itself was no longer described by number or cargo, only as the 1984 Indiana loss. Local folklore began to form, cautiously. Some residents spoke of hearing a distant horn that night, others of lights moving along the tracks without sound. None of these accounts were recorded officially. Investigators had learned early that the absence of evidence was not improved by accumulation of rumor. By summer, the rail corridor had fully normalized. Schedules were full, crews rotated. The missing train had left no operational scar. Yet in the archives, the file continued to resist closure. Each review ended the same way. No fault identified, no corrective action recommended. The disappearance stood alone, detached from cause and consequence. And that isolation became its defining feature, a single event unconnected to failure, error, or repetition. In a system built on predictability, it represented something else entirely, a movement that obeyed every rule until it no longer appeared to exist within them. By late summer of 1985, the case had taken on a different character, not urgent, but persistent. It remained unresolved in a way that resisted both explanation and dismissal. Conrail's internal review slowed, not because questions had been answered, but because they no longer produced new ones. A Transportation Safety Board analyst requested access to the original dispatch tapes once more. This time, the focus was not on what was heard, but on what followed. The gap after the final transmission was examined frame by frame. No emergency signal followed. No automated alert triggered. The system behaved as though the train had completed its segment cleanly and exited the monitored zone. This detail troubled the analyst. In theory, a train that stopped unexpectedly would still occupy track circuits, generating warnings. Yet the circuits cleared. The rails read empty. A maintenance supervisor later testified that this should not have been possible without physical removal of the train, or a failure so comprehensive it would have affected other traffic. Neither scenario matched the evidence. Meanwhile, a quiet audit of rolling stock inventories was conducted across neighboring states. Car numbers associated with the missing train were flagged. None appeared in service elsewhere. No repainted cars. No duplicates. The equipment did not resurface under new identities. The crew's personal effects complicated matters further. Their cars remained in the yard parking lot. Lockers were untouched. Time cards showed no anomalies. Families were granted access to belongings under supervision. One spouse noted that her husband's watch had stopped the morning of the disappearance, not unusual, but later remembered as symbolic. A local rail enthusiast began compiling newspaper clippings and dispatch rumors. He noted that similar losses, though never entire trains, had been reported sporadically in earlier decades, usually attributed to wartime confusion or clerical collapse. None occurred in peacetime under modern systems. His notes were never published. By the end of the year, the case had entered what officials termed administrative suspension. This did not mean closure, only that active investigation had ceased. Files remained accessible. Reviews could be requested. No one expected answers to emerge without provocation. Trains continued to pass through the same stretch of Indiana rail without incident. Engineers reported nothing unusual. Radios remained clear. Signals functioned perfectly. The system behaved as though correcting for something that no longer existed. That consistency became its own kind of anomaly. In private correspondence, one Conrail supervisor wrote that the incident felt less like a failure and more like a subtraction. The phrase was never included in any official document. As the year ended, the missing train existed only in absence, an object once fully accounted for, now present only through the gap it left behind. And in Indiana, along a route that had never been closed or altered, trains continued to enter and exit a place where one had followed every rule, cleared every signal, and then, without disruption, stopped being there at all. By early 1986, the disappearance had settled into a narrow corridor of concern, shared mainly by those who had worked the line long enough to know what normal looked like. For newer employees, the missing train was a footnote. For veterans, it was a quiet reference point they did not like to touch. A routine systems upgrade that spring forced engineers to review historical anomalies. The 1984 Indiana loss surfaced again, flagged automatically by its unresolved status. During this review, A technician noticed something previously overlooked. The train's identifier had been released from the system earlier than protocol allowed. Not reassigned, released. The distinction was subtle but meaningful. It suggested the system had concluded the train's journey without recording its end. When asked how that could occur, software engineers offered possibilities that required cascading failures across independent safeguards. No evidence supported such a chain. More troubling, no other data corruption was found in the system from that period. Track workers interviewed around this time reported an odd consistency. The segment where the train disappeared required less maintenance than comparable stretches. Ballast settled evenly. Rails showed uniform wear. One worker joked that nothing heavy ever argues with that part of the line. The comment was not written down. The families of the crew received a final update that summer. Conrail confirmed there would be no further active search unless new evidence emerged. The wording was careful, final without being absolute. One family member later said the letter felt less like closure and more like withdrawal. Local folklore, restrained at first, grew more specific. A few residents claimed that on fog-heavy mornings they heard the low vibration of engines without seeing trains. Others described signal lights flickering briefly when no traffic was scheduled. None of these reports aligned in time or detail. Investigators logged none of them. A rail safety conference that year included a closed-door session on unexplained losses. The Indiana train was referenced obliquely as a non-recoverable event under modern controls. The phrase unsettled attendees. Modern systems were not supposed to produce such outcomes. By autumn, the case had acquired a strange status. It was acknowledged, documented, and yet functionally absent from decision-making. No policies changed. No safeguards were added. The system had absorbed the loss without adjustment. Engineers continued to run the route. Some admitted later that they felt relief each time they passed the final signal point and emerged on the other side. Nothing ever happened. The line did not repeat itself. That lack of repetition became the most unsettling feature of all. In a margin of the reopened file, someone wrote a single line in pencil. Event did not propagate. The author was never identified, and so the missing train remained what it had become from the beginning. Not an accident, not a mystery demanding solution, but a subtraction the system had accepted without protest. As the years moved toward the end of the decade, the disappearance of the train took on a peculiar afterlife, one shaped less by investigation and more by institutional memory. By 1987, the case was no longer raised in formal reviews unless prompted by automation. It surfaced only when systems flagged unresolved anomalies older than 3 years, at which point it was acknowledged and set aside again. A transportation researcher from a Midwestern university requested access to non-sensitive records as part of a study on infrastructure reliability. The Indiana loss caught his attention because it lacked a failure mode. In his notes, he described it as an event without a mechanism. He later remarked to a colleague that such cases were often excluded from published research because they complicated models rather than improving them. Trackside residents continued to report nothing unusual, no debris, no abandoned cars, no altered land. What persisted instead was a subtle shift in how people described the area. Directions were given with qualifiers: past the quiet stretch, before the long straight. The language avoided implication while acknowledging difference. One retired signal operator, interviewed privately, recalled that on the night of the disappearance he had felt a momentary sense of completion, as though a process had finished cleanly. He could not explain the feeling and did not report it at the time. Years later, he admitted it bothered him more than any alarm would have. In 1988, a new digital inventory system was introduced across Conrail's network. When historical data was migrated, the missing train produced an error state, complete records without a terminating entry. Engineers resolved the issue by archiving the record as indeterminate. The system accepted the designation and moved on. Around the same time, a rail photographer reviewing negatives from the mid-1980s noticed an empty stretch of track captured on the night in question. The image showed nothing unusual: no lights, no motion, no distortion. What unsettled him was the timestamp, which placed the photo minutes after the train should have passed. The track was empty. The photograph was never published. By the end of the decade, the Indiana line had seen thousands of successful runs. New crews replaced old ones. Procedures evolved. The missing train receded further into abstraction. Yet among those who knew the story, a quiet understanding remained that the system had once behaved as though subtraction were a valid outcome. That something could enter, comply, and then leave the framework of record entirely. The rails did not remember it. The schedules did not adjust for it. Only the absence endured. And in Indiana, where the line continued unbroken through fields and towns, the place where the train had last been acknowledged remained unmarked, carrying forward a question no one had found a way to ask properly. By 1989, the disappearance had reached a stage familiar to archivists but unsettling to engineers. It had become stable. No new information emerged, yet the case refused to decay into irrelevance. It remained intact, unchanged, and unresolved, an anomaly preserved by its own consistency. That year, a routine federal audit of rail safety procedures briefly intersected with the Indiana case. Auditors reviewed how Conrail handled incidents that fell outside standard classifications. The missing train appeared in an appendix, referenced only by date and route segment. One auditor later noted that it was the only case in the review that lacked a corrective recommendation. There was nothing to correct. A senior dispatcher nearing retirement offered a final reflection during an exit interview. He stated that the system closed the loop on its own. When asked what he meant, he clarified that every process, from signaling to inventory, had resolved internally without external input. "It's like the train reached a conclusion we couldn't see," he said. The comment was omitted from the transcript. Meanwhile, subtle behavioral changes persisted among crews. Engineers reported double-checking mile markers instinctively near the segment. Some slowed slightly without realizing it. Others noted a brief sense of disorientation. No fear, just a momentary uncertainty about distance. None filed reports. Nothing measurable occurred. Local folklore shifted tone. Earlier rumors of vanished lights or phantom sounds gave way to quieter descriptions. Residents spoke of the area as unfinished or already past. These phrases carried no narrative, only implication. A rail infrastructure journal published a short piece on non-catastrophic losses in complex systems. Without naming the Indiana case, the author described a scenario where redundancy masked disappearance rather than exposing it. He concluded that such systems could, under rare conditions, absorb absence without disruption. The idea drew little attention. By the end of the year, Conrail itself began preparing for structural change. Discussions about mergers and reorganization circulated internally. Files were reorganized again. The missing train's record was migrated, archived, and retained without amendment. As institutional focus shifted, the case moved further from resolution, not because it was forgotten, but because it had become unapproachable. There was no lever left to pull, no process left to test. And yet the stretch of Indiana rail remained unchanged. Trains passed through it every day. Signals responded. Radios stayed clear. The system behaved perfectly, which, for those who remembered 1984, was the most unsettling outcome of all. Because nothing in the years since had explained how a modern train, running on active track under constant supervision, could enter the network, and then simply stop being part of it. By 1990, the missing train had crossed from operational concern into institutional residue. It remained in the system not as a problem to solve, but as an entry that refused deletion. Each annual audit acknowledged it briefly, then moved past it. The case had become a constant background condition, present but no longer actionable. A systems engineer reviewing historical anomalies noted that the Indiana loss differed from every other unresolved incident on record. In derailments, something remained. In thefts, something resurfaced. In clerical failures, something duplicated. Here there was only a clean subtraction. The train's identifiers were not reused. Its path was not corrected. The system behaved as if completion had occurred somewhere it could not observe. That year, a former Conrail dispatcher testified informally before a transportation ethics panel, speaking about decision-making under uncertainty. He mentioned an incident where silence replaced failure. "We were trained to respond to alarms," he said, "not to the absence of them." The remark was noted but not pursued. Families of the crew marked 6 years without resolution. For some, the lack of physical evidence made grief provisional. They lived with a permanent pause rather than closure. One family declined a memorial service, stating they could not commemorate an event that had never finished happening. Track inspections continued to show nothing unusual. Ground-penetrating surveys conducted for unrelated infrastructure upgrades detected no buried mass consistent with rolling stock. The land offered no answer. It had not been disturbed. A rail historian reviewing the period later observed that the 1980s marked a transition from mechanical systems to increasingly abstract control. He suggested that rare events might occur at the boundary between physical movement and recorded movement, where a thing exists only if the system continues to acknowledge it. He cited the Indiana train as an example without explanation. As the decade progressed, references to the case became quieter still. New management viewed it as legacy noise. Younger engineers learned of it only if they asked the right questions. And yet, among those who had been there, the memory persisted, not of fear, but of certainty. The certainty that something had happened without leaving a mark. Trains continued to pass through the same stretch of Indiana rail. Nothing slowed them, nothing followed them. The line did not change. But in the files, the train remained exactly where it had always been, recorded as having departed, recorded as having entered the route, and never recorded as having arrived. A journey begun, a system satisfied, an ending that never appeared. By 1991, the case had aged beyond investigation and into reflection. It appeared less often in operational reviews and more often in conversations about system limits. The train's disappearance had become a reference point, used quietly when discussing what modern infrastructure could not account for. A former Conrail manager, now consulting privately, revisited the case while advising on redundancy planning. He noted that every safeguard had functioned correctly. Signals cleared, logs updated, inventory reconciled. The system did what it was designed to do, he wrote, which is why this should not have happened. The contradiction remained unresolved. That same year, a rail safety workshop in Chicago included an off-record discussion on non-catastrophic loss. The participants shared examples of events that failed to escalate, minor faults that corrected themselves, anomalies that did not propagate. The Indiana train was mentioned only once as an outlier. The room went quiet. No one had an explanation to offer. Local communities along the route continued life unchanged. Farms expanded. Roads were paved. Children crossed the tracks daily without knowing what had once been lost there. Yet older residents still described the area with care, avoiding emphasis. The stretch had become ordinary again, though not neutral. A dispatcher who had been on duty that night kept a personal notebook. In it, he wrote years later that the silence after the last transmission felt finished. Not broken, not interrupted, finished. He never shared the notebook publicly. By the early 1990s, Conrail itself was preparing for dissolution and restructuring. Files were transferred, archived, and condensed. The missing train's record was preserved, but stripped to essentials: dates, route, status. No narrative survived the process. A transportation law review briefly examined the case while discussing liability in unresolved losses. The authors concluded that absence without fault fell into a category the law was not equipped to address. Responsibility could not attach to what had not failed. As institutional memory thinned, the case moved further from resolution. It no longer belonged to a single company or agency. It existed between records, acknowledged but unclaimed. And still, the rail line functioned perfectly. Every train that followed passed through the same place, obeyed the same rules, and emerged intact. The system showed no memory of deviation, which left only one unresolved element: that in Indiana in 1984, a train had complied with every requirement of movement and accountability, until it no longer appeared in the world those requirements were meant to describe. By 1992, the disappearance had become something closer to a case study than an incident. It appeared in footnotes, in training hypotheticals, in conversations that began with "there was once a train" and ended without conclusion. The absence had acquired structure. A transportation professor teaching systems reliability referenced the Indiana loss during a lecture on failure detection. He described it as a scenario where no threshold was crossed. There had been no overload, no derailment, no collision, nothing dramatic enough to force recognition. The system had accepted the outcome without protest. Students asked where the train went. The professor did not speculate. Records from that year show that a small maintenance reroute was proposed near the original segment, part of a broader efficiency upgrade. During planning, engineers noticed a slight discrepancy between measured track length and historical time-to-pass data. The difference was minimal, within tolerance, and ultimately dismissed. Still, one engineer circled the figure in red and wrote, "Segment behaves shorter than mapped." The note was never addressed. Families of the crew received a final administrative update. The language was careful and definitive. No new searches were planned. No new leads existed. The case would remain archived but open-ended. One family member later said the letter read less like an explanation and more like an acceptance that explanation was no longer possible. Local newspapers ran a short retrospective on rail history in the region. The missing train was mentioned in a single sentence, framed as an unresolved anomaly from the 1980s. Readers wrote letters asking for details. None were printed. Meanwhile, the rail line continued its quiet consistency. Crews rotated, technology updated, signals modernized. Nothing disrupted the route. Nothing repeated the loss. A retired signal technician reflected privately that the most unsettling part was how cleanly the event fit into the system's logic. "If something breaks," he said, "you see the break. This didn't break anything." His comments circulated among colleagues, then faded. As the early 1990s progressed, the case became less about a missing train and more about a limit, a place where records stopped corresponding to physical reality. Investigators had long since exhausted mechanical explanations. Human error had been ruled out. Sabotage lacked evidence. What remained was a gap that could be described but not entered. And in Indiana, along a stretch of track that required no caution and inspired no alarm, trains continued to pass through the same mile markers where one had done everything right, and then simply ceased to be part of the system that acknowledged it. By 1993, the missing train had become a quiet reference for those studying limits rather than failures. It appeared not in emergency manuals, but in marginal notes, examples of what remained after every standard explanation had been applied and found insufficient. A small research group examining legacy rail data requested anonymized access to Conrail-era anomalies. When the Indiana case surfaced, one analyst remarked that it resembled a completed transaction without receipt. The phrasing circulated briefly, then vanished from subsequent drafts. It was too precise and therefore too uncomfortable. Track upgrades continued along the route. Old signal housings were replaced. Relay cabinets were modernized. During installation, technicians compared historical schematics to physical layout and noted no discrepancies. The line matched its records exactly. There was no missing spur, no forgotten siding, no abandoned tunnel capable of hiding a train. The geography refused to cooperate with speculation. A rail photographer revisiting old negatives from the 1980s found an image taken months after the disappearance. It showed the same stretch of track under heavy cloud cover, empty and unremarkable. What drew his attention was not the scene, but the absence of motion blur. The exposure suggested a train should have been passing. There was none. He archived the photo without comment. In private correspondence, a former Conrail Systems planner wrote that the disappearance coincided with a transitional moment in rail operations, when physical movement increasingly depended on abstract confirmation. He suggested that under rare conditions, a system might resolve itself around absence rather than error. The letter was never sent. Local memory thinned further. Younger residents knew nothing of the incident. Older ones referenced it only when pressed. The place itself inspired no superstition. There were no markers, no warnings, no changes in land use. The line cut through fields and towns as it always had. By mid-decade, the case was no longer discussed as a mystery to be solved. It was treated as a remainder, what persisted after explanation had ended. The missing train had left no scar, no disruption, no aftermath beyond paperwork and memory. And yet, the fact of its disappearance remained unchanged. In a system built on continuity, that constancy was itself unsettling. Because nothing about the years that followed had explained how a train could obey every rule, satisfy every safeguard, and still leave behind a gap that no process could close. The rails continued to carry weight, the signals continued to clear, and the absence continued to exist, quiet, stable, and unresolved. By 1994, the case had become something archivists referred to as contextual noise, a known irregularity that no longer influenced decisions, but could not be erased without explanation. It lived in footnotes and appendices, acknowledged and bypassed in the same motion. That year, a federal transportation database was standardized across multiple agencies. Older rail incidents were reclassified to fit new categories. The Indiana disappearance resisted this process. It did not meet criteria for accident, theft, derailment, or clerical loss. After several attempts, it was placed under a provisional label, unresolved operational absence. The category contained only one entry. A systems auditor reviewing the migration later remarked that the case behaved like a closed loop with no output. All inputs were present, all confirmations recorded, yet nothing emerged at the end. He added privately that such loops were theoretically impossible outside simulation. Meanwhile, trackside communities continued to change. New housing appeared, old barns collapsed. The rail line remained a constant through it all. Residents used it daily without thought. The stretch where the train vanished inspired no caution, no folklore, no sign of disruption. It was ordinary in a way that felt intentional. A former engineer, now retired, returned to the route out of curiosity. He rode a cab through the segment and later said the passage felt shorter than he remembered. He checked the mile markers. They were correct. The sensation persisted anyway. He did not report it. Academic interest flickered once more when a journal on infrastructure resilience published a brief note on events that failed to propagate. The Indiana train was mentioned obliquely as an example where redundancy absorbed loss completely. The note drew no responses. By late 1994, the case had lost even its ability to provoke speculation. It had become a settled absence, resistant to narrative. Those who encountered it professionally learned to move past it. Those who remembered it personally learned to live with it. And yet, in the background of every system audit, every reliability lecture, the same question lingered without being spoken. What happens when a system succeeds so completely that it cannot recognize what it has lost? In Indiana, the rails continued to answer nothing. They carried trains forward, recorded their passage, and offered no indication that anything had ever been missing. The absence remained, not growing, not fading, simply present, like a completed sentence with no visible punctuation. By 1995, the missing train had entered what one transportation archivist described as its silent phase. There were no longer active reviews, no academic inquiries pending, and no families pressing for updates. The case had not been solved. It had simply reached a point where nothing new attached to it. A routine infrastructure survey that year introduced more precise measurement tools along the Indiana corridor. Laser alignment confirmed what engineers already believed. The track geometry was sound, uninterrupted, and historically consistent. There was no physical gap that could account for the disappearance. The train had not slipped into forgotten space. The space itself was intact. A data analyst tasked with reconciling legacy records noticed something subtle. The missing train's operational timeline showed no error flags. In the database, it appeared as a completed process missing only its final confirmation. The analyst likened it to a document saved without closing, technically finished but never acknowledged. He corrected nothing. Rail employees who had worked during the 1980s began retiring in greater numbers. With them went the lived memory of the night itself. Newer staff encountered the case only as an oddity, often during training scenarios meant to illustrate edge cases. The example was usually skipped quickly. It did not teach prevention. Local residents occasionally mentioned the disappearance when prompted by anniversaries or rail articles. Their recollections were calm, factual, and notably devoid of embellishment. No one claimed to have seen the train vanish. No one described light or sound. The absence had always been administrative before it was anything else. A regional historian attempted to place the incident within a broader narrative of Midwestern rail decline. He concluded that the case resisted contextualization. There was no economic shift, no labor dispute, no infrastructure failure to connect it to. It stood alone. In the mid-1990s, rail traffic increased along the route. Heavier loads passed through the same segment daily. Nothing strained. Nothing faltered. The line absorbed the traffic without protest. That endurance became part of the story's quiet tension. If something extraordinary had happened, the system showed no sign of being altered by it. There was no scar, no corrective scar tissue. By the end of the year, the case file was accessed only once during a clerical audit. The reviewer initialed the page and moved on. No notes were added. And so the missing train remained where it had always been, present only as a gap in completion, a journey that began, progressed, and then ceased to require recognition. In Indiana, where rails crossed farmland and towns with equal indifference, the place where the train vanished continued to function perfectly, offering no clue, no warning, and no indication that anything had ever gone missing at all. By 1997, the disappearance had crossed into something closer to inherited knowledge. Those who knew of it no longer expected answers. They expected continuity. The case existed not as a question, but as a condition, an accepted irregularity embedded in otherwise reliable systems. That year, a private firm contracted to modernize dispatch software reviewed legacy anomalies to ensure compatibility. The Indiana train triggered a warning during testing. The system flagged it as an unresolved object occupying no physical space but retaining a valid operational identity. Engineers resolved the issue by assigning it a terminal state labeled inactive, location undefined. The system accepted this without error. A consultant later remarked that this was the first time he had seen software accommodate absence as a stable outcome. Meanwhile, ground conditions along the route remained unchanged. Track inspections showed no subsidence. Drainage functioned normally. There was no evidence of buried material, no metallic signatures, no structural anomaly. The land offered nothing to contradict the records or to explain them. A retired Conrail executive interviewed for an oral history project spoke briefly about the case. He described it as an event that completed itself. When pressed, he clarified that every procedural step had occurred: dispatch, confirmation, reconciliation, except the one that required physical arrival. The system closed the book, he said, even though the chapter never ended. Public interest never reignited. Unlike dramatic accidents, the disappearance lacked imagery. There were no photographs of wreckage, no eyewitness accounts to anchor speculation. Without these, the story resisted retelling. It remained quiet. Rail crews continued to pass through the same segment without hesitation. Some admitted later that they felt a subtle sense of relief each time they cleared the final mile marker. Not fear completion. The feeling faded quickly, leaving no urgency behind. In academic circles, the case appeared occasionally in discussions of negative evidence, situations where the absence of indicators was itself the only indicator. The Indiana train was cited carefully, without embellishment. No conclusions were drawn. As the decade closed, the incident's status remained unchanged. No new records emerged. No new interpretations gained traction. The train remained missing in the most literal sense, not located, not destroyed, not reassigned. And yet, the rail network continued to function as though it had absorbed the loss completely. In Indiana, where the line cut through ordinary terrain without interruption, the place where the train vanished required no marker. It had become a point the system moved past effortlessly, leaving behind an absence that asked nothing and explained nothing. By 1999, the case had thinned to its quietest form. The records still existed, but they were no longer read as narratives, only as confirmations that something had once resisted conclusion. The missing train was no longer discussed as an event, but as a boundary of explanation. That year, a graduate student researching transportation anomalies requested interviews with retired rail employees. Several declined. One agreed on the condition that the conversation not be recorded. He described the disappearance not as frightening, but as clean. "If it had crashed, we'd have dealt with it," he said. "This didn't leave anything to deal with." The student later wrote that the case challenged the assumption that systems fail visibly. In his notes, he questioned whether absence could be treated as data. His advisor suggested the topic was too speculative for formal study. The student changed focus. A routine review of land use maps showed no alteration to the corridor since the 1980s. No easements revoked. No emergency access roads added. The place where the train vanished had not demanded attention. It did not assert itself. Local residents who had once followed the story found it increasingly difficult to explain why it had unsettled them. Nothing bad had happened there since. No accidents. No delays. The rail line behaved impeccably. And yet the knowledge remained that something had once passed through and never completed the passage. A retired dispatcher, sorting through old papers, found a personal note he had written in 1984. It read only, "Waited for the follow-up call. It never came." He kept the note and said nothing. As the century closed, the rail industry itself prepared for new consolidation. Conrail's identity would soon dissolve into larger entities. Files were transferred again. The missing train survived each transition intact, carried forward as an unresolved record through every reorganization. The persistence of that record, unchanged, uncorrected, became its final testimony, not to failure but to the limits of recognition, because nothing in the years that followed had suggested where the train went, how it left, or why the system accepted its absence without protest. All that remained was one final acknowledgement, that the disappearance had never asked to be explained. It had simply occurred. The last formal reference to the case appears in a quiet place, far removed from rail yards or dispatch rooms. In 2003, during a routine archival consolidation following Conrail's dissolution, a records clerk flagged the Indiana file for review. The question was procedural, whether unresolved anomalies older than 15 years should be retained in full. A supervisor initialed the recommendation without comment. The file was kept. By then, nearly 2 decades had passed since the train entered a stretch of Indiana rail and failed to complete it. Every institution connected to the event had changed names, systems, or leadership. The crew's families had learned to live with an absence that had never been confirmed as loss. The rail line itself had been upgraded, digitized, and absorbed into new networks. Yet the record remained unchanged. In a final internal memo, a transportation historian tasked with summarizing legacy cases wrote that the 1984 disappearance represented a completed operation without observable conclusion. He referenced the early years of Conrail, when the system had been built to stabilize chaos rather than interrogate silence. The train, he suggested, had been absorbed by a framework not designed to question outcomes that produced no alarms. No recommendation followed. The memo ended there. Those who still remembered the case spoke of it without drama, not as a mystery but as a reminder. Systems are built to notice disruption. They are less prepared for subtraction that behaves like completion. Trains continue to pass through the same Indiana corridor every day. Signals clear. Radios remain silent unless spoken into. Nothing slows, nothing repeats. The place where the train vanished offers no resistance, no warning, no echo loud enough to be measured. But occasionally, engineers remark on a sensation difficult to define, not fear, not confusion, just the sense of passing through a segment that feels already finished before it begins. The feeling lasts seconds and leaves nothing behind. The train was never found. No wreckage surfaced. No error was corrected. And in Indiana, along a perfectly ordinary stretch of rail, the disappearance remains exactly where it began, not as a question demanding resolution, but as a quiet absence the system learned to accept. The rails remember nothing. The records remember enough. And whatever crossed that line in 1984 did not announce its leaving, only its completion.